So one of the largest hunger strikes I've seen in my lifetime happened among Palestinian prisoners that Israel was holding. There was two prisoners, in fact, Bilal Diab and Tahir Halaleh, who went 77 days without food. And they said that they were protesting administrative detentions, among other things. For example, Diab had been held without charge since last August. Halaleh had been in administrative detention since June of 2010. Earlier, he'd been held in administrative detention for 6.5 years, meaning they don't tell you what you've been charged with. They just hold you. And like, oh, well, that's it. It's indefinite detentions, which now, unfortunately, the United States of America does to some extent as well, in fact, to a large extent at Guantanamo Bay. So they were protesting that. They were also protesting the fact that they couldn't have prisoners in the Gaza Strip, couldn't have family come visit them in certain instances. And then in some instances, they couldn't get phone calls. There was solitary confinement as punishment, etc. And this strike went on so long that eventually the strike that they began on February 27th was joined by hundreds of others on April 17th. Ultimately, there was, according to Israel, 1,600 prisoners. According to the Palestinians, 2,500 prisoners who are on hunger strike. And that is a huge part of the 4,500 Palestinians being held by Israel. And eventually, in fact, just very, very recently, they reached an agreement. Egypt was the mediator here, and they came to a conclusion. And in fact, people doing the hunger strike got a lot of what they wanted. They will be getting phone calls from relatives. They will be allowed to get visitation from relatives. The solitary confinement is ending. And on the main issue of administrative detention, they say at least there needs to be another hearing where evidence is presented. Now, when that hearing happens, of course, is very important. How it gets enforced is incredibly important. But these are some significant breakthroughs here. And ultimately, I think that they won not just because of the hunger strike, but because they were right. Of course, another third factor was that tomorrow is when Palestinians commemorate what they call Nakba, the catastrophe, as they call it, when Israel was established 64 years ago, and there might have been gigantic protests. Now, two things that I like about the results here. One, it was a tactic here, the hunger strike, that was peaceful and nonviolent, and it gave them the moral high ground. And number two, they were right. They should not be held in solitary confinement. You should not have these indefinite administrative detentions. That is, not in keeping with human rights. If they're so dangerous, and they say these two guys were part of Islamic Jihad, and God, they're so incredibly dangerous that we had to keep them in this conditions, well, then present evidence. But they've never presented evidence on these two guys. And on so many others, hundreds, thousands of others. That's why they do the administrative detention, because they don't actually have the evidence. And in fact, Halaleh last time was released at the end because they never wanted to present any evidence, whether they had it or they didn't. They just said, okay, all right, sorry for keeping you 6.5 years. Now you're free to go. So the fact that they have done this through peaceful, nonviolent means is fantastic. The fact that they reached the right conclusion is also fantastic. It takes tremendous courage. I got to tell you, man, I had a doctor's appointment that I couldn't eat for this morning. After 2.5 hours, I was going out of my mind. And I'm reading the story, I'm like, Jesus, 77 days. I mean, there's a lot that I can endure. I think I have strong will. Hunger strike is not among them. After like 7.5 hours, I'd be like, oh my God, I made a terrible mistake. I immediately regret this decision. 77 days, all the credit in the world to them.